As you probably already know, Obadiah is just one chapter, smallest book in the Old Testament, and we refer to Obadiah and Amos and Hosea and some of these other things as minor prophets. But a lot of times when you talk about a minor prophet, don't think that they're less valuable than Jeremiah or Isaiah or some other prophet. The reason that they're referred to as minor prophets is simply because um, uh, the content itself is not as extensive in terms of the number of pages in the text. Obadiah, however, is a little bit different than usually what you see with prophets. Typically, in the Old Testament, when you see prophets, God would identify a person to speak for him, and the majority of the time, not 100% of the time, but the majority of the time, that prophet is being directed to go and to confront the nation of Israel and to call the nation of Israel to repentance or some other type of action. Obadiah is different in that his primary task is to speak to one particular group of people that we refer to as the Edomites. So these are not the descendants of Jacob or of Israel. These are the descendants of Esau, which we'll see in a minute. And so to give you some background, the name Obadiah is a common name. It's not an unusual name. You see it probably 12 different times in the Old Testament, 12 different people with this name. And Obadiah, from the scripture that we're looking at today, is not one of those 12. And it is believed that in his letter or in his book, there's no specific reference to who he is, probably because those people that he was speaking to were well aware of who he was. And so there was no need for him to identify himself in the text. You know, a lot of times we've seen in other scriptures, particularly in New Testament scriptures, the author will identify himself, such as Paul or James or whomever. But in this case, it is just believed that those people already knew who Obadiah was. And so there was no need for him to identify it. And again, what makes this the most significant is the fact that he hasn't been called by God to go address the nation of Israel, but to address the enemy of Israel, the Edomites. And we'll see in a minute that ultimately the Edomites are completely wiped out. You probably don't know any Edomites today because there are none. And so the primary lesson that we as believers should get from the book of Obadiah is that we should not glory or take satisfaction in the demise of others, in the difficulties of others. When we see our enemies get what's coming to them in our eyes, or we see the downfall of our enemies, even if they've been persecuting Christians, we are not to gain any satisfaction from that. God does not appreciate that. And you know, we are humans. It's sort of instinctively when someone treats us badly or someone hurts us, we can tend to take satisfaction when we see them get theirs. And so, for example, you know, maybe you've been working at a company for a long time and you've been waiting for a promotion, and somebody else gets that promotion who's undeserving of it. And then ultimately, because they weren't qualified, they fail in that position and they get fired. And then our tendency is to take satisfaction in the fact that they finally got what was coming to them. As believers, as followers of Christ, that should not be our constitution. That should not be the thing that we get satisfaction from. And so we have to, before we read this, before Bob reads it to us, we have to have some context for who the Edomites are. And so some of this will be review. Maybe some of it is going to be new for you. I don't know. We'll see. But you have to go all the way back to Genesis to begin to understand who the Edomites are. And you'll remember that Abraham is told by God that he is going to be blessed and that he's going to have a great nation come from him. And so we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, correct? And so we know that Isaac marries Rebekah and has the two of them have twins, Esau and Jacob. Now, Esau, we know, is the firstborn of the twins. He comes out first. And the Bible tells us that he was kind of an odd looking thing, baby, that he was hairy and had this red tint to his skin. And so, as they did in ancient times, the way they named their kids was a bit different than we do it today. And they concluded because he looks like an orangutan that they'll just call him Harry, not Harry, but Hairy, because he was covered with hair on his body. But something that's important to keep in mind is that when you're the firstborn in the ancient Near East, there were some privileges that came along with that simply because you're the firstborn in the family, firstborn male. And if you were the firstborn male in the family, you were automatically entitled to 2 times as much more than your siblings in terms of the inheritance that you would get from your father. In addition to that, you would be entitled to a special blessing before your father died. There would be a laying on of the hands, and the blessings would be passed on to you as the firstborn. And the third privilege is the fact that you would then become the patriarch of the family. You would be the, for a lack of a better term, ruler or governor of your family. And so that's where Esau was headed. That was his station in life. That's what he was entitled to. Now, Jacob, who is the second born twin, we know the Bible tells us that he comes out holding on to Esau's heel, and he's referred to as the supplanter, what's a good word? Begins with a D, and I can't even think of it. Anyway, the deceiver, the deceptive one. And there is this constant battle between the two brothers. At one point, finally, we know that Esau, who was out hunting, comes home, and Jacob is sort of this homebody. He's cooking a meal. He's cooking beans, a stew, and Esau is hungry, and so he asked his brother for a meal, and his brother says, "Absolutely, you can have a meal. I'll sell it to you." And Esau's price for that meal was his birthright. And very short-sighted, he goes ahead and he sells his birthright to his brother. Now, it is said that the bean stew that Jacob was cooking had a red tint to it. So maybe there was tomatoes in it that gave it a red color. But in any event, the word Adam is for red, and this is where Esau gets the nickname Edom, because not only does he look red, his body, his skin, but he's eating this red stew that is paying for his birth, that he's paying his birthright for. And so from this point forward, Esau and all of his descendants who would come after him would be referred to as Edomites, the red people. And so we know that over time, there's this conflict that continues. And what has happened, and what happens a lot of times in families and just in relationships in general, two people will have conflict, and they'll tell their family members and they'll tell their friends their side of the story. And so their friends and family will take up that side, and they'll have animosity and bias towards the other people. Well, that's what happened with these two brothers. Eventually, the two brothers are going to reconcile. They're going to get over their disagreements. But the problem was Esau had already poisoned the well, and so all of his descendants were still angry and still did not like the Israelites, and it just continued on and on through the generations. And And so we get to the point where these Edomites, these descendants of Esau, would continually take advantage of their cousins, the Israelites. They would rob from them, steal from them, loot from them. When they were in need of help, they wouldn't help them. And if you go all the way back to the settling of the land, you'll recall that Esau and his descendants settled on the eastern shore of the Jordan River instead of going on the western side with all the other nations of Israel. And they were told if they go on and settle on the eastern side, they were required by God, if their brothers, their cousins, their family on the western side were ever in trouble, they would be required to come and help them in battle when other people came against them. But they never did that. They would watch their brothers fight and struggle, and they wouldn't come alongside them and help them out. And so ultimately, when Nebuchadnezzar goes into Jerusalem and destroys the nation of Israel, takes those people captive and takes them into bondage into Babylon, the Edomites, the Israelites family, just watched on the sidelines, watched it happen. And then after Nebuchadnezzar and his armies cleared out, they went in and pillaged and looted what was left of their brothers. And so the whole point of this letter or book of Obadiah is to reveal God's displeasure with the way that we treat our enemies, and to understand that God sees everything and that he is going to deal with this. He's going to reconcile this himself. And so with that, we're going to have Bob read this to us. If you would, Bob.
We have heard a message from the Lord that an ambassador was sent to the nations to say, "Get ready, everyone. Let's assemble our armies and attack Edom." The Lord says, "I will cut you down to size among the nations, Edom. You will be small and despised. You are proud because you live in a rock fortress and make your home high in the mountains. Who can ever reach us way up here?" you ask boastfully. Don't fool yourselves. Though you soar as high as eagles and build your nest among the stars, I will bring you crashing down. I, the Lord, have spoken. If thieves came at night and robbed you, they would not take everything. Those who harvest grapes always leave a few for the poor. But your enemies will wipe you out completely. Every nook and cranny of Edom will be searched and looted. Every treasure will be found and taken. All your allies will turn against you. They will help to chase you from your land. They will promise you peace while plotting your destruction. Your trusted friends will set traps for you, and you won't even know about it. At that time, not a single wise person will be left in the whole land of Edom, says the Lord. For on the mountains of Edom I will destroy everyone who has wisdom and understanding. The mightiest warriors of Teman will be terrified, and everyone on the mountains of Edom will be cut down in the slaughter. And why? Because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel. Now you will be destroyed completely and filled with shame forever. For you deserted your relatives in Israel during their time of greatest need. You stood aloof, refusing to lift a finger to help when foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem. You acted as though you were one of Israel's enemies. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You shouldn't have rejoiced because they were suffering such misfortune. You shouldn't have crowed over them as they suffered these disasters. You shouldn't have plundered the land of Israel when they were suffering such calamity. You shouldn't have gloated over the destruction of your relatives, looting their homes and making yourselves rich at their expense. You shouldn't have stood at the crossroads, killing those who tried to escape. You shouldn't have captured the survivors, handing them over to their enemies in that terrible time of trouble. The day is near when I, the Lord, will judge the godless nations. As you have done to Israel, so it will be done to you. All your evil deeds will fall back on your own heads. Just as you swallowed up my people on my holy mountain, so you and the surrounding nations will swallow the punishment I pour out on you. Yes, you nations will drink and stagger and disappear from history as though you had never even existed. But Jerusalem will become a refuge for those who escape. It will be a holy place, and the people of Israel will come back to reclaim their inheritance. At that time, Israel will be a raging fire, and Edom a field of dry stubble. The fire will roar across the field, devouring everything and leaving no survivors in Edom. I, the Lord, have spoken. Then my people living in the Negev will occupy the mountains of Edom. Those living in the foothills of Judah will possess the Philistine plains and take over the fields of Ephraim and Samaria. And the people of Benjamin will occupy the land of Gilead. The exiles of Israel will return to their land and occupy the Phoenician coast as far north as Zarephath. The captives from Jerusalem exiled in the north will return to their homeland and resettle the villages of the Negev. Deliverers will go up to Mount Zion in Jerusalem to rule over the mountains of Edom, and the Lord himself will be king.
All right. Thank you, Bob. That was a mouthful. God has reached the point where he says, look, guys, enough is enough. And he says, I'm going to intervene and I'm going to pass judgment on the descendants of Esau, people who were not following God and who persecuted their family members, although by this point they're distant cousins, but they were family nonetheless. And so there's a few lessons here that I'd like to touch on. The first one is this: that we should not refuse a brother who is in need, despite what we feel about them personally, despite whether or not they've hurt us in the past, despite whether or not they agree with us. Verses 10 and 11 said this. This is what Bob read. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, meaning the nation of Israel, you will be covered with shame and you will be destroyed forever. Pretty harsh words. God is saying through Obadiah, because you came against your brother, I'm going to penalize you eternally. On that day, you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. And so what is being said here is that here you have the Edomites, the family members of the Israelites, who stood on the sidelines and watched the enemy, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, come in and destroy their family members. And God is saying, the fact that you weren't there doing the battle with the Babylonians doesn't mean that you aren't just as guilty if you stood there and watched it happen and didn't help. And so the same thing is true for us. It's easy to sit on the sidelines and to see stuff happen to other people. But if we are able and we choose not to get involved and to help others, we're just as guilty as the one that are committing the crimes. And so he passes judgment on the Edomites. They didn't participate in the destruction. They didn't participate in taking the Israelites captive, but they certainly sat there and watched it and probably cheered it on, I would imagine. And so they helped, or they failed to help their brother in need. And so it's important to know, and this isn't new for us, sins of omission, meaning just not taking action, are equally looked down upon by God as the sins that we actively commit. Proverbs 15:5 says, whoever mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. And so if we take satisfaction, or we just sit back and watch even our enemies get destroyed, we're going to pay that price. So doing nothing is a sin. The second lesson is that we're not to rejoice or take pleasure or take satisfaction in our enemy's misfortune. Verse 12 says, you should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. And so again, They are on the outside looking in at their family members being destroyed by the enemy, and they're feeling good about it. They're excited about it. They're happy about it. Um, uh, it is easy to find ourselves in a place where we take pleasure in those who have mistreated us, hurt us, done bad things to us that we don't deserve. And when they get theirs, finally, it's just human nature, I think, to feel good that finally someone's getting the person who hurt us. And God is saying, don't be that person. Do not find yourself in that position. The Bible teaches us that God sees everything and God will reconcile everything on our behalf. Vengeance is not for us to obtain; it's left up to God. And so that's a hard thing to live day to day, particularly when you're talking about church. There's so much division in churches. There's so much animosity. There's so much territorialism from church to church and community to community that when one church is seemingly elevated and doing well, the lesser church or the smaller church um, is jealous or feels less than. Um, don't find yourself in that position. Um, Taking pleasure in the misfortunes of someone else is a sin, even if you're not the one that's participating in it or you didn't cause it. The third thing is do not become selfish. Verse 13 says, "You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster." And so, again, what has happened is, in this particular case, the Edomites, they watch from the sidelines their family members get taken into captivity, go through this battle with the Babylonians, and then to rub their nose in it, to pour salt in the wounds, they go and they pillage what's left over um, uh, of, um, of Jerusalem and Judea. And so, um, God is aware of what our enemies are doing. He sees it, but he's also aware of our response to our enemies. Matthew 5:44, you'll recall this, says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." That's a very churchy thing to say and to flaunt, but God means it. He intends for us to love everybody, even our enemies. And when we are treated wrong and when we're persecuted, we are to pray for those people. And we are to hope that God will deliver those people, even if we don't want to see it. Um, if you want to see a practical application of this, go back and read Jonah and how Jonah hated the Ninevites. But God delivers the whole city of Nineveh. And if you recall the story, Jonah gets mad about it. He's upset about it. And God ultimately says, "Hey, these people belong to me, so you really have no reason to be upset about it." The same thing is true with us day to day. Even our enemies belong to God, and we have nothing to say about it. We should take pleasure in God doing what he wants to do. And so I had mentioned earlier that there are no Edomites today. They haven't existed for a long time. The last of the Edomites that we know about are part of King Herod's dynasty. King Herod is the one. You go all the way back to the Christmas story. He was the puppet ruler that the Romans had placed in power to be the king over the Jews. He was an Edomite. And after the falling in 70 AD, the Romans came in and they destroyed the city. After that point, there's no historical record of Edomites ever. And so what is interesting, it was not unusual in the ancient world for one nation to come in and destroy another nation. But over and over again, what would happen was like what happened with the Israelites. A remnant of people would come back together and and the nation would reassemble and grow again. That's never happened with the Edomites. They've never come back. And so what happens, what's even more ironic is that when the Romans decided to come into Jerusalem and to wipe out the temple in 70 AD in the city of Jerusalem, this time the Edomites decided to go and help their brothers and sisters. They said, let's go, let's confront the Romans, let's help our Jewish brothers and sisters. They get into the city, the Romans surround the city, 20,000 troops, and the city is burned to the ground. And all of the Edomites were completely destroyed. None are left. Verse 18 says, Jacob or Israel will be a fire and Joseph a flame. Jacob and Joseph's referring to the nation of Israel, the Jews. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau. The Lord has spoken. He said, that's it. And that is exactly what happened. We have that event isn't outlined in the scriptures, but we do have countless other reliable historical records that reveal that that's in fact what had happened. And so it's important for us to understand that we don't walk with the Lord to spite other people. We're not in competition with our enemies. Our calling is to live for the Lord, for both those people who are like-minded, other believers, as well as those people who are our enemies. And we are to treat both equally and to allow God to be the one to decide what happens to people. And when God decides to judge or to persecute or to even wipe out an entire nation of people, it is not for us to make judgment or to gain pleasure out of that.